The letter trembled in Eli's hands, his face shifting from curiosity to horror as his eyes reached the final line. My mother's smile never wavered as she watched him, that familiar, practiced smile I'd known all my life, but suddenly seemed like a mask slipping to reveal something darker beneath. "This isn't okay," he whispered, gripping my arms so tightly I'd later find bruises, his voice barely audible over the crackling fireplace and my family's forced laughter. I didn't understand then, as I took that weathered paper with my name scrawled above those 7 devastating words, that everything I believed about myself was built on blood and lies, or that the woman who tucked me in each night had stolen more than just my origin story. The highway stretched ahead of us like a ribbon, winding through the autumn landscape. Eli's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as we drove toward my family's countryside home. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're going to be fine," I said. "They're going to love you." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know. It's just meeting the whole family at once is a lot." "It's just Thanksgiving," I said, brushing my hair from my face. "Mom's probably made enough food to feed a small army. Dad will ask about your job exactly once, then talk about football for the rest of the weekend." Eli nodded, but I noticed him check his phone when I turned to look out the window. 3rd time in the past hour. Work stuff, probably. He'd been distracted lately, buried in some research project he couldn't talk much about. "Your mom isn't going to make me participate in any weird family traditions, is she?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Like, I don't know, dressing up as pilgrims or something?" I laughed. "No pilgrim customs, promise. Though she does make everyone say what they're thankful for before dinner." "That I can handle," he said, relaxing slightly. "As long as I don't have to wear a buckled hat." The familiar turn onto the gravel driveway came up, and my stomach did a little flip. Coming home always felt like this, a mixture of comfort and tension. I loved my family, but there was always an undercurrent, something I could never quite name. Mom was on the porch before we even cut the engine, waving enthusiastically. Her cardigan was the color of pumpkins, perfectly coordinated with the seasonal wreath on the door. "There's my girl," she called out, rushing down the steps. "And this must be Eli." Mom enveloped me in a hug that smelled like cinnamon and her familiar perfume. She held me at arm's length, inspecting. "You look tired, honey. Are you getting enough sleep?"
"I'm fine, Mom."
The drive was just long. I turned to Eli, who was retrieving our bags from the trunk. "Mom, this is Eli." "Eli, this is my mother, Maureen." Eli put on his most charming smile, the one I fell in love with at that conference 3 years ago. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Mrs. Wilson. Emma talks about you all the time." "Oh, call me Maureen, please." She hugged him too, and I saw him stiffen slightly before returning the embrace. "We're just so excited to finally meet the man who stole our Emma's heart." Dad appeared in the doorway, tall and a bit stooped. He raised a hand in greeting, but didn't come down the steps. "Stephen," Mom called back to him. "Come help with their bags." "It's okay," Eli said quickly. "I've got them." We made our way inside, the house exactly as I remembered it. Polished wooden floors, family photos arranged precisely on the walls, the smell of something delicious baking in the oven. "Emma," a familiar voice called from the living room, and my cousin Grace appeared, her dark hair longer than I remembered. "It's been forever." We hugged, and I felt a surprising wave of emotion. We'd been close as kids, but for some reason, Mom had kept us apart these past few years. Something about Grace's parents, and a falling out I never fully understood. "You look amazing," I said, stepping back to look at her. "How's New York?"
"Busy."
"Expensive." Exactly what I needed. She glanced at Eli, and I made the introductions. "So you're the famous fiancé," Grace said, giving him an appraising look. "Emma's been pretty secretive about you." "Have I?" I asked, surprised. Grace's eyes lingered on me. "Your last few emails were light on details." Mom clapped her hands together. "Let's get you two settled in. Emma, I've put you in your old room. Eli, you'll be in the guest room down the hall." I caught Eli's amused glance. Mom's traditional streak was showing. "Mom, we live together," I reminded her. We're engaged. And this is still my house, she said, her smile never wavering. Humor your old-fashioned mother this weekend. Dad finally spoke up. Let's get these bags upstairs. Dinner's at 6. As we followed him up the familiar staircase, Eli leaned close to my ear. Separate rooms? Really? Don't worry, I whispered back. The floorboards only creak if you don't know which ones to avoid. After we'd unpacked, Mom insisted on a trip down memory lane. She pulled out albums I hadn't seen in years, showing Eli embarrassing photos of me with braces and unfortunate haircuts. This was Emma's ballet phase, she said, pointing to a picture of me in a tutu. She was always tripping over her own feet, but she was determined. I was 7, I protested. And this was her high school graduation. Mom continued, flipping pages. Valedictorian. We were so proud. Eli studied each photo carefully. You haven't changed much, he said, nudging me gently. Still the same smile. I felt a rush of gratitude for him in that moment. The way he could make me feel seen, even surrounded by the ghosts of my past selves. Dad remained in his armchair, nursing a glass of bourbon, while Mom dominated the conversation. Every now and then, he'd nod or offer a one-word response when directly addressed. This was normal for him. He'd always been quiet, especially around Mom. Grace sat across from us, her gaze occasionally lingering on me in a way that made me uncomfortable, like she was trying to tell me something without words. When Mom went to check on dinner, Grace leaned forward. So, wedding plans? When's the big day?
Spring, I said.
Nothing fancy. Just close friends and family. At the lake house, she asked. I shook my head. We found a little venue near our apartment. It's more convenient for everyone. Not for your mom, Grace said, raising an eyebrow. I'm surprised she's letting you get away with that. She's been surprisingly hands-off, I admitted. I was expecting more involvement. Grace snorted. Aunt Maureen, hands-off? That'll be the day. Dad cleared his throat, a warning in his eyes. Grace. She sat back, that unreadable expression returning. Just saying. By the time we gathered for dinner, the tension had eased somewhat. Mom had outdone herself. Turkey, stuffing, 3 different types of potatoes, homemade rolls, and pies cooling on the counter for later. Everything looks amazing, Maureen, Eli said as we took our seats. Mom beamed. Traditional recipes are important in this family. Some things should never change. As we began passing dishes, I noticed Dad's hands trembling slightly. He'd been drinking steadily since we arrived, but this seemed different. There was something in his eyes, a wariness I couldn't place. Eli noticed it too. As we reached for the cranberry sauce at the same time, he leaned toward me and whispered, Why does your dad look terrified of your mom? I stifled a laugh. What are you talking about? Watch him, Eli murmured. Every time she speaks, he flinches. I tried to dismiss it, but now that he'd pointed it out, I couldn't unsee it. The way Dad seemed to calculate each response before speaking, how his eyes constantly tracked Mom's movements around the table. After dinner, Mom insisted we gather in the living room. The fireplace crackled, casting long shadows across the walls I'd grown up with. Grace sat next to me on the sofa, while Eli perched on the armrest beside me. Dad had retreated to his usual chair, looking more relaxed now that the formal part of the evening was winding down. I found something special today, Mom announced, entering the room with a small wooden box I'd never seen before. I was going through some old things in the attic and came across this. Everyone watched as she carefully opened the box. The hinges creaked, the sound oddly ominous in the quiet room. It's from back when everything was simpler, she said, her fingers delicately sifting through the contents. Before all the complications of adult life. She withdrew a letter, yellowed with age, its edges soft and worn. It was sealed in a plastic sleeve, as if preserved for something important. I thought you'd find this interesting, Eli, she said, handing it to him. It has your name in it. Eli's brow furrowed as he accepted the letter. My name? Well, not exactly your name, Mom said with a strange smile, but close enough that it caught my attention. A chill ran down my spine as Eli carefully removed the letter from its protective covering. His hands were steady, but I could sense his confusion. We'd only been engaged for 8 months. Why would his name be in some old letter of my mother's? The room fell silent as he unfolded the paper. I watched his face, trying to read his reaction. At first, there was only curiosity. Then his expression shifted to confusion. And then, as his eyes reached the bottom of the page, something else entirely took over. Horror. Eli's fingers tightened around the paper, knuckles turning white. He looked up at my mother, who was watching him with an odd intensity. He gripped my arm, hard enough that I knew there would be marks later. "Why would she keep this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Keep what?" I asked, suddenly alarmed. Instead of answering, he turned the letter toward me. "You need to read the last line." I took the paper from him, my hands suddenly unsteady. The handwriting was unfamiliar, tight and slanted. I skimmed down to the bottom, my heart pounding in my ears. The final line stood out in stark relief against the aged paper. "The child must never know the truth." And above it was my name. "Mom, what is this letter?" I demanded, pulling her into the kitchen while the others remained in the living room. Her face was composed, serene even, as she straightened a dish towel that was already perfectly aligned on the rack. "Just an old family thing, Emma. Don't worry about it." "Don't worry about it?" I held up the letter, my hand shaking. "My name is on this. It says, the child must never know the truth." "What truth, Mom?" She sighed, as if I was overreacting to something trivial. "You know how dramatic old letters can sound. It's nothing really. From a complicated time." "Whose handwriting is this?" I pressed. "It's not yours. It's not Dad's." "An old friend," she said dismissively. "Someone who was confused about a lot of things." I stared at her, trying to make sense of the disconnect between her calm demeanor and the cold dread spreading through my chest. "You're not telling me everything." She placed her hands on my shoulders, the way she used to when I was a child having a tantrum. "Emma, it's Thanksgiving. Let's not make a scene over an old piece of paper." Her patronizing tone only fueled my unease. "Fine," I said, stepping back from her touch. "But this conversation isn't over." When I returned to the living room, Eli was standing by the window, his posture tense. Dad had disappeared, and Grace was leafing through a magazine with forced casualness. "Let's go upstairs," I whispered to Eli. Once inside my childhood bedroom, with its faded posters and bookshelf full of young adult novels I'd outgrown years ago, Eli finally spoke. "I've seen handwriting like this before," he said, his voice low. "In a file my dad kept before he died." I sat on the edge of my bed, the letter still clutched in my hand. "What do you mean?" "The way the Y's and G's are formed." He pointed to specific letters. "It's distinctive. My dad had letters filed away with the same handwriting pattern." "Your dad? But he died when you were in college," I said, confused. "What would your dad have to do with my family?" Eli ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was deeply troubled. "I don't know. But look, there's a signature here." He pointed to the bottom corner of the letter, where I hadn't noticed a faint name before. "Naomi Callister," I read aloud. The name meant nothing to me. Eli's face went pale. Naomi Callister was my dad's first fiancé, before he met my mom. The floor seemed to shift beneath me. That can't be right. Why would your dad's ex-fiancé write a letter about me?" "I don't know," Eli said, already pulling out his phone. "But I'm going to find out." While I sat frozen on the bed, he began searching online, his fingers moving rapidly over the screen. After several minutes, he looked up, his expression grim. "Naomi Callister disappeared in 1996, he said. "She was presumed dead after a year-long investigation. She was 6 months pregnant when she vanished. My birthday was December 18th, 1996. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered, but a cold, terrible suspicion was taking root. "Emma," Eli said gently, "do you have any baby pictures? From when you were first born?" I nodded mechanically, going to the closet where Mom kept our family albums. I pulled out the one labeled Emma, first year, and began flipping through it. First bath. First smile. First Christmas. But as I went backwards, I realized something was missing. The earliest photo was labeled 6 months old, sitting up. Nothing earlier. No newborn photos. No hospital pictures. No coming home outfit. This doesn't mean anything, I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Maybe Mom just wasn't good about taking pictures back then. Eli didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. A soft knock interrupted us. Grace stood in the doorway, her eyes darting nervously down the hall. "Can I come in?" I nodded, and she slipped inside, closing the door behind her. "Did she finally give you the letter?" Grace asked without preamble. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You knew about it?" Grace nodded, perching on my desk chair. "She's been hiding it for years. I found it once, when I was 16. That's why she sent me away to boarding school." "What?" I couldn't process what she was saying. "Mom told me your parents wanted you to go to that prep school for college preparation." Grace laughed bitterly. "My parents had nothing to do with it. Aunt Maureen convinced them I needed discipline, after I broke into her private desk. But all I did was find that letter. And ask questions." "What did she tell you about it?" Eli asked. "Nothing," Grace said. She denied it existed. Said I was making things up for attention. But I know what I saw. That night, I barely slept. Dreams of a woman I didn't know haunted me, a face similar to mine in ways I couldn't articulate, crying, reaching out to me. I woke up with tears on my cheeks and a hollowness in my chest that felt ancient, like I'd carried it my whole life without knowing. When morning came, I found Dad alone in the kitchen, making coffee. The house was quiet. Everyone else was still asleep. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to ask you something." He turned, and in the early morning light, he looked older than I'd ever seen him. Worn down. Afraid. "The letter," I said. "The one Mom gave Eli." "Who is Naomi Callister?" The mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the tile floor. Coffee spread like a dark stain at his feet, but he didn't move to clean it up. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "It was on a letter, Dad." "And Eli?" "Eli says she was his father's fiancé before she disappeared. In 1996. Dad's shoulders sagged, as if bearing a weight too heavy to carry any longer. "I wanted to tell you," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. "For years I wanted to. But your mom, she wouldn't let me." My heart hammered against my ribs. "Tell me what, Dad?" He looked past me, toward the stairs, checking if we were still alone. "Yes, Naomi was an ex. We dated briefly in college. But I never knew what happened to her after we split up." And I pressed, sensing there was more. His eyes finally met mine, filled with a guilt so profound it took my breath away. "Your mom showed up months later. With a baby. With you." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the counter to steady myself. "Are you saying Mom isn't my biological mother?" "I don't know," he whispered. I never asked too many questions. She said you were hers, that she'd been hiding the pregnancy because she wasn't sure if she wanted to keep you. But you weren't together then?" He shook his head. "We reconnected when she brought you to me. Said you were mine. That she needed help." A noise on the stairs made him stop abruptly. He quickly bent down to clean up the broken mug, avoiding my eyes. I backed away, my mind racing. I bumped into Eli, who had come down behind me, catching the end of our conversation. In our room, the door locked behind us, Eli finally said what we were both thinking. "You might not be their biological daughter." I covered my mouth to stifle the sound that wanted to escape. Not quite a sob, not quite a scream. Something in between. "We need to know for sure," Eli said, his voice steady, an anchor in the storm of my thoughts. "I brought a swab kit for work. We can do a rush DNA test." I nodded, unable to form words. If what we suspected was true, then who was I? And what had happened to Naomi Callister? For the rest of the day, we avoided my mom as much as possible. She sensed something was wrong. I could tell. Her eyes followed me around the house. Her questions about our plans were too casual, too frequent. Grace cornered me in the hallway upstairs after lunch. "What did you find out?" she whispered. I pulled her into my room, where Eli was researching Naomi's disappearance on his laptop. "My dad basically confirmed that Mom showed up with me as a baby," I said, "after Naomi disappeared." Grace nodded, not looking surprised. "When I was 9, I overheard a huge fight between them. Your mom was screaming about the sacrifice she made and how no one would ever know the truth." "Did you ever tell anyone?" Eli asked. "Who would believe me?" Grace said. "Aunt Maureen is like the perfect suburban mom on the outside. She's on 3 charity boards. She bakes for the church fundraiser. People see what they want to see. She kept me away from you after you found the letter. I realized. She made sure we didn't spend time together growing up." Grace nodded. "And then after I found it, I was sent away. She told everyone it was because I was getting into trouble with boys." Something occurred to me then. The attic. Mom said she found the letter in the attic. "Is there anything else up there?" "I don't know," Grace said. "That's where I was headed when I found the letter in her desk. I never made it up there." That afternoon, while Mom was at her book club and Dad was watching football in the den, the 3 of us crept up to the attic. It was dusty and cramped, filled with Christmas decorations and old furniture. But behind a stack of boxes, Eli found a loose floorboard. "Look at this," he called softly. Beneath the floorboard was a small space containing a locked trunk. The lock was old, but sturdy. "I can pick this," Grace said. At our surprised looks, she shrugged. "One of the few useful skills I learned at boarding school." It took her 15 minutes of careful work with a bobby pin, but finally the lock clicked open. Inside the trunk, we found a treasure trove of secrets. Journals with Naomi's name on them, hospital documents, and a tiny birth bracelet with "Baby Girl Callister" printed on it. "Oh my God," I breathed, picking up the bracelet with trembling fingers. Eli was leafing through one of the journals when something fell out, a small, tarnished medallion. He gasped, picking it up. "What is it?" I asked. "This medallion," he said, his voice shaking. "It's identical to one my dad kept on his keychain. He never went anywhere without it." He turned it over to show me the engraved initials, and C+ER. "Naomi Callister and Eli Robert Sr.," he whispered. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a voice message from the DNA lab. With dread and hope tangled in my chest, I played it on speaker. "This is Dr. Walters with the preliminary results you requested. We've confirmed 0 biological relation to either of your listed parents. If you'd like to discuss these results further, please call our office." I collapsed onto an old trunk, the phone slipping from my numb fingers. Eli caught it before it hit the floor. "Emma," he said gently, "look at this." He held out a photo he'd found tucked into one of the journals. It showed a young woman with my eyes, my chin, holding a newborn. Behind her was a familiar structure, our family's old barn. "This was taken here," I said. "That means she was still around after I was born." Eli nodded, his expression grave. "And look at the date on the back. December 20th, 1996. 2 days after your birthday." When we confronted my dad again, late that night when Mom was asleep, he finally told us everything he knew. Or, at least, everything he claimed to know. "Maureen showed up with you right after Naomi disappeared," he admitted, his voice barely audible in the dark kitchen. "She said Naomi had abandoned the baby, abandoned you, because she couldn't handle being a mother." "And you believed her?" I asked, incredulous. He hung his head. "I believed her because I wanted to. I was in love with her. Had been since college. And suddenly she was there, telling me I had a daughter, that she wanted to help raise you. So, you never questioned where I really came from? Never thought to check if Naomi had actually abandoned her baby?" My voice rose despite my efforts to keep quiet. "You have to understand," he pleaded. "Back then, there was no easy DNA testing, no social media to trace people. Naomi had moved away, cut ties with everyone. When Maureen said she'd been in touch with her, that Naomi had given you to her to bring to me, it seemed plausible. But it wasn't plausible. Not with what we now knew." "Dad," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. The remains of a woman who went missing in 1996 might be buried on this property. He went deathly pale.
No.
That's not. Maureen wouldn't. But his voice trailed off, uncertainty replacing denial. Back in my room, Eli paced while I sat numb on the bed, trying to process everything. I think I know what happened, Eli said finally, his voice lowered. I think Naomi came here after you were born. Maybe to confront your dad. Maybe to tell him about you. And she met my mom instead. I whispered. Eli nodded, his face grim in the dim light. Naomi didn't abandon you, Emma. His voice shook as he said the words we both feared. She was silenced. I looked up at him, the truth settling over me like a shroud. She may be buried on this land. And in that moment, with the wind howling outside and the house creaking around us, I started to believe him. The barn stood at the edge of the property, its weathered wood silvery in the early morning light. Eli and I had slipped out of the house before dawn, armed with flashlights and a shovel from the garden shed. The grass was stiff with frost beneath our feet, crunching with each step. Are you sure about this? Eli asked, his breath visible in the cold air. I wasn't sure about anything anymore. But I nodded, clutching the photo of Naomi and baby me in front of this very barn. We have to know. The barn door groaned as we pushed it open. Inside, the air was musty and cold, filled with shadows and forgotten things. Farm equipment my dad never used, old furniture wrapped in tarps, boxes of Christmas decorations too bulky for the attic. Where do we start? I whispered, suddenly overwhelmed by the task. Eli studied the photo again. Let's look at where she was standing. By that support beam. We made our way to the back of the barn, where sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden slats, creating golden bars across the dirt floor. I knelt by the beam, running my fingers over the aged wood. Look at this, Eli said, pointing to a section of the wall behind the beam. The wood looked newer than the surrounding planks, as if it had been replaced. Together, we pulled at the boards. They came away easily, too easily, revealing a small hollow space behind. And there, nestled in the darkness, were remnants of a life cut short. A mud-caked boot, a tarnished metal locket, and a rusted bracelet that matched the baby one we'd found in the trunk. I staggered backwards, ball rising in my throat. Oh God. Eli caught me before I fell. We need to call the police. Not yet, I said, fighting to regain my composure. We need more. Mom has connections in this town. People trust her. Emma, Eli said gently, this is evidence of a possible murder. I know, I whispered.
But we need to be smart about this.
We need to make sure she can't talk her way out of it. We carefully replaced the boards, marking the spot so we could find it again. As we walked back to the house, I felt like I was moving through a dream or a nightmare. Grace was waiting for us in the kitchen, nervously sipping coffee. Her eyes widened when she saw our dirt-streaked clothes. Did you find something? She asked in a hushed voice. Before I could answer, she glanced over her shoulder and lowered her voice further. There's something I need to tell you. Something I remembered last night. We huddled together at the far end of the kitchen, voices barely above whispers. When I was about 7, Grace began, I woke up in the middle of the night to screaming. I thought it was a nightmare at first, but when I looked out my window, I saw Aunt Maureen's car driving away. It was late, after midnight. Did you tell anyone? Eli asked. Grace shook her head. I convinced myself it was a dream. But after finding that letter, and now everything else, I don't think it was. I took out the letter again, studying it more carefully in the morning light. In the margins, I noticed something I'd missed before, a faint scribble in pencil. If anything happens to me, don't trust her. A chill ran down my spine. Naomi had known. She'd been afraid. We need to go to the police, I said, my resolve hardening. But first, we need to make sure Mom can't interfere.
Eli nodded grimly.
I have an idea. That night, we planted a small recorder in my mother's bedroom while she was downstairs preparing dinner. It felt invasive, wrong, but so did everything else about this situation. We didn't have to wait long. After everyone had gone to bed, We heard her on the recording, speaking in hushed tones on her phone. "She knows," my mother's voice said, cold and clear. I should have done what I did to the mother. Eli and I stared at each other, horror mingling with grim vindication. He immediately copied the recording to 3 different devices, ensuring we wouldn't lose this crucial evidence. "That's it," I said, my hands trembling as I listened to the voice of the woman who raised me. "That's enough." The next morning, we drove to the sheriff's office in the next county over, away from my mother's sphere of influence. Before we left, Eli emailed copies of everything we'd found to a detective he trusted in his hometown. The officers were skeptical at first, but as we laid out our evidence, the DNA results, the journal entries, the photos, the recording, their expressions changed from doubtful to concerned. "We'll need to get a warrant," one of the deputies said, picking up the phone. Everything happened quickly after that. We returned to the house to find police cars already in the driveway. My mother was hosting Sunday brunch, her famous quiche on the table, when the officers walked in. She was unnaturally calm as they read her rights, a small, controlled smile on her lips. Only when they mentioned the evidence we'd found did her composure crack. "You can't prove anything," she hissed, her eyes finding mine across the room. "That woman left her child, abandoned her baby." My heart pounded as I stood my ground. "We have the bracelet, the journals, the recording, Mom." "It's not everything," the lead detective admitted, "but it's enough to hold her while we investigate further." As they led her away, my mother's eyes never left mine, cold, calculating, utterly without remorse. In that moment, I finally saw what had always been there, hidden beneath the perfect mother facade. Standing in the doorway of the only home I'd ever known, watching the police car drive away with the woman I'd called Mom for 28 years, I finally said it aloud. "She's not my mother. Not anymore." The weight of those words settled around me, not as a burden, but as a truth. A beginning. Eli's arms circled my waist, solid and warm. "What now?" he asked softly. I looked back at the house, at my father slumped in his chair, at Grace hovering uncertainly by the stairs, at the life built on lies that was crumbling around us. "Now we find out who I really am," I said. "And we make sure Naomi gets justice. Justice for the woman whose eyes I had, whose child I was, whose life had been stolen by the woman who raised me as her own." The truth was horrifying, but finally knowing it felt like taking my first real breath. The days following my mother's arrest blurred together. The house that once felt suffocating now felt hollow, like a stage set abandoned after the final performance. Dad moved through the rooms like a ghost, drinking more than usual. Grace stayed, despite having a flight back to New York scheduled. And Eli remained steadfastly by my side, his research background proving invaluable as we continued to unravel the mystery of who I really was. "We need to be thorough," he said as we returned to the barn, this time with proper tools and gloves. "The police are focusing on the house, but we know this is where the photo was taken." The morning was cold, the sky a flat gray that promised snow. Yellow police tape fluttered around the property, but the officers had cleared us to continue our own investigation, as long as we reported anything we found. "I still can't believe this is happening," I said, my breath visible in the frigid air. 28 years of thinking I knew who I was. Eli squeezed my hand. "You know who you are, Emma. Your DNA doesn't define you." But it did in ways I was only beginning to understand. The shape of my eyes that had never matched my mother's. The natural curl in my hair that had always confused the hairdresser Mom took me to. The inexplicable feeling of being an outsider in my own family. We worked methodically, removing the boards we discovered earlier and carefully excavating the area behind them. Each scoop of dirt felt like we were digging into my own past, exposing secrets long buried. "Look," Eli said suddenly, his voice hushed with reverence. Behind a particularly rotted section of wood, we found more items: a leather-bound journal with water-damaged pages, a tarnished watch that had stopped at 11:42, and most chillingly, strands of hair preserved in a plastic bag, labeled in my mother's precise handwriting. "Evidence. NC." She kept trophies, I whispered, horror washing over me. She actually kept evidence of what she'd done. Eli carefully bagged everything, his expression grim. This isn't just about hiding a crime anymore, Emma. This was methodical, calculated. We called Detective Harper, who arrived within the hour. Her face remained professionally neutral as she examined our findings, but I caught the slight widening of her eyes, the tightening of her jaw. "This changes things," she said finally. "We were looking at a case of possible manslaughter, maybe second-degree murder, if we could prove intent. But this..." She held up the bag of hair. "This suggests premeditation." The weight of her words settled over me. My mother, the woman who'd packed my lunches, bandaged my scraped knees, taught me to drive, had planned to kill someone, had kept souvenirs of her crime. Back at the house, Grace was waiting on the porch, hugging herself against the cold. "I remembered something else," she said as we approached. "That night, when I heard the screaming and saw Aunt Maureen's car leave, I thought it was a dream because when I went downstairs, everything was normal the next morning. But there was mud on the floor. Lots of it. And Aunt Maureen was cleaning it up before dawn. I remember because she was humming while she did it." The image was chilling, my mother humming as she erased evidence of violence. "We need to check phone records," Eli said. "If your mom called anyone that night, or in the days after Naomi disappeared." "She would have been careful," I interrupted. "You've seen how meticulous she is." But as it turned out, even Maureen Wilson had made mistakes. Detective Harper called that evening with news. "We've gotten access to your mother's old phone records," she said. "There was a call made from your family home to a burn phone the night Naomi Callister was last seen alive. And another call to the same number 3 days later." "Can you trace it?" I asked, hope flaring. "The number's long inactive. But here's the interesting part. The phone was purchased with a credit card belonging to William Taylor." The name meant nothing to me, but Grace gasped beside me. "Uncle Will? Mom's brother?" Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Uncle Will, who I'd met only a handful of times throughout my childhood, who always seemed uncomfortable around my mother, who stopped coming to family gatherings after I turned 12. "We need to find him," I said. Finding William Taylor proved easier than expected. He was living just 2 hours away, teaching English at a community college. When we called, he seemed unsurprised to hear from us. "I've been waiting for this day," he said, his voice weary. "For a long time." We met him at a diner halfway between towns, a neutral location where he seemed more at ease. He was a thin man with salt and pepper hair and hands that couldn't stay still, constantly rearranging the silverware, adjusting his glasses, tapping the table. "I didn't know what she'd done," he began, once we'd settled into a booth far from other patrons. "Not at first. She called me that night, hysterical, saying she needed help, that there'd been an accident." "But it wasn't an accident," Eli said. "It wasn't a question." William shook his head, eyes fixed on his untouched coffee. "By the time I got there, it was already done. There was so much blood, and Maureen was different.
Calm.
Methodical. She'd already wrapped the body in plastic." I flinched at the casual reference to Naomi, my biological mother, as the body. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Grace demanded. "She's my sister," William said simply, as if that explained everything. "And she convinced me it was self-defense. That this woman had threatened her, had been stalking Stephen for years. It wasn't until later, when I found the baby clothes, that I realized there was more to it." "Baby clothes?" I repeated. "A whole nursery, set up in their basement.
Pink everything."
Maureen had been planning to take you for months. She'd been tracking Naomi's pregnancy, waiting for the right moment." The diner seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "She planned it all. From the beginning." William nodded, misery etched in every line of his face. "Maureen couldn't have children. There were complications during a procedure when she was younger. She never got over it. And when she found out Stephen's ex was pregnant, she saw an opportunity," Eli finished. "I helped her hide the evidence," William admitted. "I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. But I swear I didn't know she was going to take you. I thought she was just covering up a fight gone wrong. What about my dad? I asked. Did he know? William hesitated. Stephen was convenient. He wanted to believe Maureen's story, that Naomi had abandoned you, that you needed a home. He didn't ask questions because he didn't want answers. By the time we left the diner, snow was falling in thick, silent flakes. William had agreed to give a formal statement to Detective Harper, finally unburdening himself of the secret he'd carried for nearly 3 decades. In the car, I leaned my forehead against the cold window, watching the world turn white. I don't even know who to be angry at anymore. Eli reached across the console to take my hand. You can be angry at all of them. Your mom for what she did. Your dad for looking the other way. William for helping cover it up. And Naomi? I asked quietly. Can I be angry at her too? For not protecting herself better? For putting herself in danger? You can feel however you need to feel about her, Eli said. She was a real person, not a saint. And she's a part of you. We drove back to the house in silence, the windshield wipers keeping time with my racing thoughts. So many questions still unanswered. So many truths still buried. But one thing was becoming clearer with each revelation. The woman who raised me was not who she pretended to be. And the truth, no matter how painful, was finally coming to light. As we pulled into the driveway, my phone rang. Detective Harper's voice was clipped, professional. We've found human remains in the old well behind your property line. Preliminary testing suggests they've been there approximately 28 years. The world seemed to still around me. Snow continued to fall, but time itself felt suspended. We'll need a DNA sample to confirm identity, she continued. But given the evidence we've gathered so far, it's her, I said. It's Naomi. After ending the call, I sat motionless in the passenger seat. Eli waited beside me, a steady presence in the storm of my emotions. She's been here all along, I finally said. All these years, while I played in that yard, while I grew up in that house, she was here. Watching. Waiting to be found. Eli's hand found mine again, warm and solid. And now she has been. Because of you. I turned to look at him. This man who had stood by me through the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. What happens now? Now, he said gently, we make sure justice is served. For Naomi. And for you. We stepped out of the car into the falling snow, facing the house that had never truly been my home. Behind it, beyond the trees at the edge of the property, lay the well where Naomi Callister had rested for 28 years, her story untold.
Until now.
The ride back from the police station was silent. Eli drove while I stared out the window, watching the winter landscape blur past. My hands still smelled like pine from the barn, a scent that now made my stomach turn. Each breath felt shallow, insufficient, as if my body had forgotten how to properly function. She never loved me, I whispered, more to myself than to Eli. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached across the console and gripped my hand tighter, his thumb making small circles against my skin. When we pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before us, transformed from childhood home to crime scene. Yellow police tape cordoned off the barn and stretched to the old well at the edge of the property. Officers moved methodically across the grounds, cataloging evidence, taking photographs. The mundane rituals of investigation making the surreal somehow concrete. I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the front door now sinister rather than welcoming. Family photos lined the hallway, school portraits, holiday gatherings, vacation snapshots. A carefully curated visual history of a family that never truly existed. These don't feel like mine anymore, I said, staring at a photo of myself at 8, gap-toothed and grinning beside my mother, beside Maureen. It's like looking at someone else's life. That evening, Grace and I sat on the back porch, sharing a blanket against the cold. The police had finally left for the day, promising to return tomorrow. Dad was staying with a friend from work, unable to face the house or the revelations about his wife. I still can't believe it, Grace said, her voice small in the gathering darkness. I mean, I knew Aunt Maureen was controlling, but this... She shook her head. She always scared me, you know? even when I was little. I turned to look at her. What do you mean? Grace pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. There was something in her eyes sometimes, like she was wearing a mask, and occasionally it would slip. She looked down at her hands. I tried to tell Dad once, but he told me never to repeat it again, that it would cause problems for the family. I realized then that Grace had her own scars from growing up in this family's orbit. Different from mine, but no less real. I'm sorry, I said, for what it's worth. She gave me a sad smile. Not your fault. None of this is. The next morning brought a fresh wave of police activity and a call from Detective Harper. My father had broken down during questioning, admitting to falsifying documents at Maureen's insistence, changing my birth certificate, hiding Naomi's records, creating a paper trail that established me as their biological child. He keeps saying he thought he was protecting you, Harper told me over the phone. But the prosecutors aren't convinced. Neither am I replied, surprised by the hardness in my voice. News traveled fast in our small town. By afternoon, I couldn't go outside without feeling the weight of stares, hearing the whispers. Theories circulated wildly, that I was lying, that Maureen was mentally unwell, that my father was the true villain. The comfortable fiction of our family had been a cornerstone of community life for decades. Its collapse left people scrambling to make sense of the senseless. A week after the arrest, forensic investigators confirmed what we already knew. The remains found in the well belonged to Naomi Callister. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull. Time of death: approximately December 20th, 1996, just days after I was born. The formal notification came in a thick envelope from the medical examiner's office. I sat on the porch steps to read it, the same steps where I'd waited for the school bus as a child, where I'd said goodbye to prom dates, where I'd hugged my parents before leaving for college. Now they were just wooden planks, worn and weathered, bearing the weight of a stranger learning about her true origins. Inside the envelope was another document, a court order explaining that my legal identity would be reevaluated after Maureen's trial. My birth certificate, social security number, even my name itself, all were based on fraudulent information. All would need to be reconsidered. I sat there for hours, the papers clutched in my hand, watching the sun move across the sky. I didn't know who I was without Maureen Wilson as my mother. Even after what she'd done, even knowing the monstrous truth, she was the only mother I'd ever known. Her voice was the one I heard in my head when I doubted myself. Her approval was what I'd sought for 28 years. That weekend, Eli suggested we get away from the house, from the constant reminders and the prying eyes of neighbors. We drove to his family's cabin in the mountains, a small, rustic place where the silence felt healing rather than accusatory. But even there, sleep eluded me. I would wake in the dark, heart pounding, images of Naomi, a woman I knew only from photographs, flashing behind my eyelids. Do you think she killed her? I asked Eli one night, both of us lying awake, staring at the ceiling. He didn't answer right away. Then, quietly, I think Naomi never left. Not by choice. 3 weeks later, the forensic lab confirmed a DNA match between the remains and me. Naomi Callister was, without doubt, my biological mother. It hit me in waves, first anger, burning and righteous. Then a strange, hollow silence. And finally, a grief so profound and confusing it took my breath away. I was mourning a woman I had never known, a connection severed before it could form, a life stolen from both of us. On a cold afternoon in January, I returned to the property alone. The police had finally removed the tape, though the investigation was far from over. Maureen remained in custody, awaiting trial. My father was staying with his sister in Ohio, broken by the weight of his complicity. I walked slowly to the barn, now bare of secrets, emptied by thorough police searches. This was where Naomi had stood, holding me as a newborn. This was where she had died, her last moments filled with terror. I sat on an old wooden crate, letting the reality wash over me. And for the first time, I spoke her name aloud, claiming it as part of my story. Naomi. The word echoed in the empty space. a ghost given voice at last. Before leaving, I placed her locket on a beam where I used to play as a child, unknowingly close to where her body had been hidden before being moved to the well. A small gesture of acknowledgement, of connection. I didn't know her, but I could honor her. The courthouse was older than the town itself, a stone building with high ceilings and wooden benches polished by generations of anxious occupants. I sat in the front row, Eli beside me, as Maureen was led in wearing a prison jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked smaller somehow, her carefully maintained appearance now reduced to gray roots showing in her hair and skin pale from months without sun. But her eyes were unchanged, calculating, controlled, revealing nothing. "How does the defendant plead?" the judge asked. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Maureen's lawyer answered. The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Despite the evidence, despite the confession of her brother, despite the remains of Naomi Callister found on her property, she was still denying everything. The trial stretched over 3 grueling weeks. The prosecution presented their case methodically, the journals, the remains, the voice recording, the falsified documents. Medical examiners testified about the fatal blow to Naomi's head, likely from a heavy object wielded with significant force. William Taylor described the frantic phone call, the blood-soaked scene he'd helped clean up. But the defense argued there was no proof of intent, that perhaps there had been an argument, a struggle, an accident. That Maureen had panicked, made a terrible mistake, but never intended to kill anyone. On the day of my testimony, I wore a simple blue dress, my hair pulled back. As I took the stand and swore to tell the truth, I looked directly at Maureen for the first time since her arrest. She stared back, impassive, as if watching a mildly interesting television program. "Ms. Wilson," the prosecutor began, "please tell the court about the letter your mother gave your fiancé last Thanksgiving." My voice shook at first, but grew stronger as I described the letter, the recording, the lies that had shaped my entire life. I explained what it felt like to look at the woman who raised you and realize she may have murdered your mother.
The courtroom was silent when I finished.
Even the defense attorney seemed momentarily at a loss. On the final day of the trial, my father took the stand. He looked decades older than his 58 years, his shoulders stooped, his once confident voice reduced to a raspy whisper. "I loved her," he said, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to know the answers. He admitted to forging Naomi's hospital discharge papers, to believing Maureen when she said Naomi was unstable and dangerous. His testimony couldn't save him from charges of obstruction and fraud, but I saw in his breakdown a desire, finally, for honesty. When the verdict came, it wasn't fully satisfying, but it was justice of a kind. Maureen was found guilty of manslaughter and concealment of a body. Not murder in the first degree, as the prosecution had sought, but enough to ensure she would spend years behind bars. As they led her from the courtroom, her eyes found mine one last time. There was no remorse there, no acknowledgement, only the same controlling gaze I'd known all my life, as if daring me to forget her, to move on, to pretend she hadn't shaped every aspect of who I was. 2 months after the trial ended, I filed the paperwork for a legal name change. Emma Wilson became Emma Callister, reclaiming the name that should have been mine from birth. It was a small thing, perhaps symbolic more than substantive, but it felt like stitching together a seam that had been violently torn. Eli was with me at the courthouse when the judge signed the document, his arms steady around my waist. "How does it feel?" he asked as we walked down the steps into the spring sunshine. "Like finding a piece of myself," I said. "Not the whole puzzle, but a start." The following weekend, we visited Naomi's grave. After the investigation concluded, I'd arranged for a proper burial, a small, private ceremony attended only by Eli, Grace, and a few others who'd supported us through the ordeal. The headstone was simple but elegant. Naomi Callister, beloved daughter, stolen mother, finally home. I knelt beside it, placing the locket I'd found in the barn against a cool stone. For an hour, I sat there, speaking aloud all the things I wished I could have told her about my life, my hopes, my struggles. I promised to carry her story forward, to ensure she wasn't forgotten. It wasn't closure, exactly. I knew enough about grief now to understand it doesn't resolve neatly. But it was acknowledgement, recognition of a truth too long buried. A week later, Eli and I were sorting through boxes in our apartment when he handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked. "A letter," he said. "One I wrote after that Thanksgiving, but never gave you." Inside was a single page, his familiar handwriting filling the space. "I don't want to marry who you thought you were. I want to marry who you truly are, whoever that turns out to be. The woman I fell in love with is still here, still strong, still finding her way forward. That's who I want to spend my life with." Through tears, I whispered, "Yes." Grace found her own path to healing. She began therapy and later shared her experience on a podcast about family trauma and emotional coercion. "Sometimes the villain wears pearls and smiles at the church bake sale," she said, her words resonating with thousands of listeners who recognized the subtle patterns of control in their own families. As for me, I started documenting everything, transcribing Naomi's journals, recording my memories, chronicling the trial and its aftermath. Not for fame or publication, but for truth. For myself. For the daughter I might someday have, who deserved to know her history, however complicated. I called it, simply, the letter that should have burned. 1 year after the Thanksgiving that changed everything, Eli and I hosted our own gathering. New house, new name, new beginning. Grace came, bringing her new boyfriend. A few close friends joined us, people who had stood by us through the darkest days. On the mantel, I placed a framed photo of Naomi, the only one I had of her smiling, her hand resting on her pregnant belly. Beside it, I lit a candle. As I looked around the table at these people who had become my chosen family, at Eli who had never wavered, at the space we were creating together, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel again so soon. Peace. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't the ending I would have chosen. But it was real, and it was mine. And as I raised my glass in a quiet toast to the mother I never knew, I whispered the words that had become my mantra through this journey of reclamation. This is okay. What would you do if the person you trusted most turned out to be a monster wearing the mask of love? If this story left you with chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more twisted tales of family secrets that refuse to stay buried.